What if the next alien invasion isn't real? For decades, a controversial theory known as Project Bluebeam has claimed that governments could stage a fake extraterrestrial event using advanced holograms, psychological operations, and mass media manipulation to unite or control the world under a new global order. Is this science fiction fueled by paranoia? Or could modern technology actually simulate an alien invasion on a global scale? In this video, we break down the origins of Project Bluebeam, the evidence supporters point to, and what skeptics say about the possibility of a staged alien event. Imagine waking up one morning to find the sky full of ships, not the kind made of steel and jet fuel, but something else, something vast, something that defies every category of object you've ever known. Imagine the broadcasts interrupting your morning coffee, the president addressing the nation, and the whole world staring upward at something that no government, no military, no scientist can immediately explain. Imagine the panic. Imagine the awe. Imagine, for just a moment, the complete and total dissolution of every assumption you've ever held about humanity's place in the cosmos. Now imagine that none of it is real. Imagine that every light in the sky, every broadcast, every trembling world leader delivering solemn and terrified statements. Imagine that all of it has been engineered, not by extraterrestrials, but by human beings, by governments, by a shadow infrastructure of technology so advanced that it can project holograms across the ionosphere, synthesize voices, and trigger mass psychological events across billions of people simultaneously. That is the premise of Project Bluebeam. And whether you believe it is the most dangerous conspiracy theory ever devised or the most prescient warning ever ignored, one thing is certain: it refuses to go away. Welcome to What We Know. What you are about to watch is not a confirmation of Project Bluebeam. It is not a debunking of it either. It is something more difficult than both of those things. It is an attempt to understand, fully, honestly, and without flinching, what Project Bluebeam actually is, where it came from, why so many people believe in it, and what that belief tells us about the world we actually live in. Because here is what I can tell you with certainty before we go any further. Some of the technologies described in Project Bluebeam do exist. Some of the historical events it references really happened. Some of the government programs it points to were real, classified, and genuinely disturbing. And the psychological and sociological conditions that would make such a program both possible and effective, those are more real today than at any point in human history. So let us begin at the beginning. Let us go back to 1994, to a man named Serge Monast, a small printing press in Quebec, and a document that would outlive its author by 3 decades and counting. To understand Project Bluebeam, you must first understand the world that produced Serge Monast, and the world that Serge Monast believed he was living in. The year is 1994. The Cold War has been officially over for 3 years, but the world feels anything but settled. The Soviet Union has collapsed, leaving a geopolitical vacuum that no one seems to know how to fill. NATO is expanding eastward, creating anxieties in Moscow that will fester for decades. The United States has just fought the Gulf War, demonstrating a kind of military omnipotence that felt almost supernatural. The internet is in its infancy, but already those who are paying close attention can sense that something unprecedented is coming. A transformation in communication, in surveillance, in the capacity of centralized powers to monitor and manipulate populations on a scale previously unimaginable. It is into this world that Serge Monast steps with a document unlike any other. Serge Monast was a Canadian journalist, author, and poet. Born in Quebec in the 1940s, he was, by most accounts, a deeply religious man, a Roman Catholic with a passionate, almost fevered belief that the forces of darkness were not metaphorical, but literal, and that they were actively working through human intermediaries to bring about a one-world government and a one-world religion that would replace Christianity with something monstrous. He ran a small news agency called the International Free Press Agency out of Quebec. He wrote books. He recorded cassette tapes. He gave speeches. By mainstream standards, he was a fringe figure, the kind of person who gets photocopied newsletters, but not newspaper columns. But within the communities that were paying attention to what he was saying, Communities of Christian fundamentalists, anti-globalization activists, early conspiracy researchers, he was considered something close to a prophet. And then, in 1994, he published the document that would make him famous forever, even though almost no one noticed it at the time. The document was called NASA's Project Bluebeam. In it, Monast claimed to have uncovered a classified NASA and United Nations program, a four-step plan to establish a new world order by staging a fake alien invasion using holographic technology, psychotronic weapons, and a coordinated global deception campaign of such audacity and scope that it would shake the very foundations of every religion on Earth. According to Monast, the plan had been in development for decades. It had been seeded through popular culture, through science fiction films, through New Age spirituality movements, through carefully engineered social changes, to prepare humanity for a moment of manufactured crisis that would cause the entire human population to willingly surrender their sovereignty to a single global authority. The alien invasion, in other words, was not the point. The alien invasion was the mechanism. The goal was total control. Now, before we go any further, I want to be precise about something. The question of whether Project Bluebeam is real, whether there is or ever was an actual classified program by this name, is almost certainly answerable, almost certainly not. There is no credible documentary evidence for a program called Project Bluebeam in the way Monast described it. No whistleblowers have come forward with clearances, no FOIA requests have turned up relevant documents, and Monast himself provided no primary source material for his claims beyond his own assertions and connections between publicly available events. But here is what makes this story complicated. The absence of evidence for Project Bluebeam as Monast described it does not mean that every component of what he described is fictional. And the cultural, political, and technological landscape through which his ideas traveled and mutated and grew is one of the most interesting stories in modern conspiracy theory history. So let us take the document seriously, not as fact, but as a text. Let us read it carefully and understand what it says. Monast's Project Bluebeam document is organized around 4 steps, which he describes as sequential phases of a global psychological operation. Understanding these 4 steps is essential to understanding everything that follows, so we are going to go through each of them in detail. The breakdown of all archaeological knowledge. Monast claimed that the first phase of Project Bluebeam would involve the engineering of artificial earthquakes at specific geographic locations around the world. These earthquakes would be timed to coincide with, or actually produce, the discovery of new archaeological evidence that would, when revealed and interpreted by compliant scientists and media, completely overturn every existing religious tradition on Earth. The discoveries would be designed to prove that all existing religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, were based on fundamental misunderstandings of ancient history, and that the truth was something radically different, something that could serve as the foundation of a new, unified world religion. He pointed to specific examples he said were already in progress. The discovery of fossils and artifacts in places like Mars, via the then-active NASA Mars exploration program, the reinterpretation of biblical sites, the emergence of new claims about the historical Jesus. He argued that the sudden proliferation of books, documentaries, and academic papers challenging traditional religious narratives was not organic but orchestrated, part of a long-running operation to soften the ground for the main event. The big space show in the sky. This is the step that most people think of when they hear the words Project Bluebeam. Monast claimed that after the archaeological groundwork had been laid, the program's operators would deploy a massive global holographic projection system to create a space show, essentially a fake alien invasion, or, in some versions, the fake return of religious messiah figures appearing simultaneously in every culture, speaking each population's native language, saying what that culture needed to hear to accept the New World Order. He described the technology as involving laser projections bounced off artificially created sodium clouds in the upper atmosphere, creating 3-dimensional images of spectacular size. He claimed that images of Jesus, Muhammad, Krishna, and other religious figures would appear simultaneously across the globe, each manifestation tailored to its local audience, before gradually merging into a single unified being, the Antichrist, or the New Age Christ, who would announce the dawn of the New World religion. This is the idea that has most captured the popular imagination, and it is the idea that has most directly intersected with modern discussions of holographic technology, military psychological operations, and classified weapons programs. We are going to spend a great deal of time on this specific claim, because unlike some other elements of Monast's theory, there is real technological context for it that is worth understanding carefully. Telepathic and electronic two-way communication. In the third phase, according to Monast, the population would be subjected to electronic mind control. Using the newly completed space show as cover, the program's operators would broadcast low-frequency signals using satellites, ELF, extremely low-frequency transmitters, and other technology that would interface directly with the human nervous system, creating the sensation of hearing the voice of God or of receiving divine instructions. This would not be perceived as external communication. It would feel entirely internal. It would feel like the voice of conscience or of divine inspiration, and it would be precisely synchronized with the holographic displays in the sky, creating a coherent sensory experience of supernatural contact that would be virtually impossible for most individuals to resist or rationally analyze. Monast connected this to real programs, specifically to the U.S. Army's research into ELF communications, to the HARP facility in Alaska, which we will discuss in detail shortly, and to what he called psychotronic weapons, devices capable of projecting voices into human skulls from a distance using microwave technology. Universal supernatural manifestations using electronic medium. The fourth and final phase involved the simultaneous triggering of multiple crisis events, economic collapse, the appearance of alien ships, as distinct from the holographic religious figures, and violent social upheaval, all designed to create such overwhelming panic and chaos that the population of the world would, as one, call out for salvation, and salvation would be provided by the architects of the crisis in the form of a unified global government, a single currency, a single military, and a single world religion. This is, in Monast's framing, the endgame, the whole purpose of everything that preceded it, not the invasion itself, but the surrender it produces. Monast published this in 1994. He was ridiculed, he was marginalized, he continued writing and speaking, and then, in December of 1996, Serge Monast died of a heart attack. He was in his early 50s. His death came shortly after the death of another journalist he had been working with on related material. His supporters have never stopped pointing to the timing. Whether Monast was a visionary, a paranoid schizophrenic, a government-targeted dissident, or some complicated combination of all three is a question we will return to. But first, we need to understand the technologies he was describing, because some of them are real. And some of the programs he referenced were very, very real indeed. To evaluate Project Bluebeam, you have to engage seriously with the technology it invokes, not because doing so will prove the conspiracy real or false, but because understanding what human beings are actually capable of building changes the nature of the conversation entirely. The line between science fiction and classified military technology has historically been a great deal thinner than the public realizes. Let us start with holograms. The word hologram is used very loosely in popular culture, and that looseness creates confusion. When most people hear the word, they think of the Princess Leia projection in Star Wars, a free-floating, three-dimensional image projected into open air, visible from multiple angles without any screen or surface. That specific technology, what scientists call a volumetric display, is something that exists in early, small-scale form in research labs today, but does not exist at the scale Monast described. You cannot, as of the time of this filming, project a kilometer-tall Jesus into the sky above New York City. But here is what you can do. In 1991, a researcher at MIT named Stephen Benton published the first research on what would become known as full-color, full-parallax holographic displays. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, holographic projection technology advanced rapidly. not toward free-floating images in open air, but toward something called Pepper's ghost projections, a technique using a reflective surface angled at 45 degrees to create the illusion of a three-dimensional image floating in space. This is the same technology used in the famous Hologram of Tupac Shakur at Coachella in 2012, and more recently in numerous stage performances featuring resurrected, deceased performers. These systems work impressively, but they require controlled environments, specific lighting conditions, specific surfaces, specific viewing angles. They cannot be deployed in broad daylight over open fields and cities. However, and this is a very important however, there is a category of atmospheric optical phenomenon that researchers have been studying and, to some degree, artificially creating for decades. It is called a plasma display, or more specifically, a femtosecond laser-induced plasma filament display. Here is how it works. When a very high-intensity laser beam is fired through open air, it ionizes the gas molecules along its path, creating a plasma, essentially a column of glowing, electrically excited gas. By rapidly scanning this laser in 3 dimensions, you can, in principle, draw images in the open air. The images are not projected onto a surface, they are created within the air itself. Researchers at institutions including MIT, the University of Rochester, and a company called Ariel Burton in Japan have demonstrated working versions of this technology. As of the mid-2010s, the resolution and scale of these plasma displays were very limited. Think fuzzy, flickering, bluish-white shapes, roughly the size of a tennis ball floating in the air. But the fundamental principle is sound, and the trajectory of the technology, extrapolated forward, is interesting. Now here is where things get genuinely strange, because it turns out that the United States military has been conducting research into exactly this kind of technology for purposes that go well beyond light shows. A 1994 Air Force paper titled Low-Cost Precision Kill Electronic Warfare discussed, among other things, the use of directed energy to create phantom images of aircraft and other objects in the sky, essentially decoys designed to confuse enemy radar and visual tracking systems. A separate Air Force research document from around the same time discussed the potential use of holographic projection technology for psychological operations, specifically the idea of projecting large images into the sky above enemy territory to cause panic, confusion, or the belief in supernatural events. This document was referenced in a 1994 Washington Post article by reporter William Arkin, who described it as a proposal for using holograms to simulate the appearance of religious figures or other culturally significant images above enemy populations during wartime. The proposal, Arkin noted, came from a real Air Force research group. It was not classified at the time of publication. Let me be very clear about what I just said. A real United States Air Force research group in a real document discussed the concept of using projected sky images of religious figures as a psychological warfare tool. Monast published his Blue Beam document the same year this article appeared. It is possible he read it. It is possible it inspired him. It is also possible they both arrived at similar ideas from a similar technological reality. But the point is, this was not science fiction. This was a serious military research proposal. And while there is no evidence it was ever implemented at the scale Monast described, the concept existed in the real world, in real documents, in real Air Force research. Let us move to the second technological pillar of Project Bluebeam, LF transmitters, HARP, and the concept of mind control via electromagnetic frequency. HARP, the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, is possibly the most misunderstood scientific installation in the world. Located in Gakona, Alaska, it is a facility that uses a powerful, high-frequency radio transmitter to study the ionosphere, the uppermost layer of Earth's atmosphere. It was built in the early 1990s with funding from the Air Force, the Navy, DARPA, and the University of Alaska. Its official scientific mission is ionospheric research, understanding how the ionosphere responds to various electromagnetic inputs, with applications in communications and radar. The facility is periodically open to the public and has been visited and studied by independent scientists from around the world. And yet HAARP has become, in conspiracy theory circles, the central node of almost every nefarious technology claim made in the last 3 decades. It has been accused of controlling weather, causing earthquakes, mind-controlling populations, and serving as the ground-based component of a space-based weapon system. Why? Why does this particular research facility attract so much suspicion? Part of the answer is that the ionosphere genuinely can be used as a kind of transmitter. When high-frequency radio waves are directed at the ionosphere, they heat and disturb it, and one of the byproducts is the generation of ELF, extremely low frequency, waves that propagate back down to Earth. This is not a classified finding. It is published in peer-reviewed journals. The military has legitimate uses for ELF communication. Submarines, for instance, can receive ELF signals through seawater. But here is what makes ELF interesting in the context of Project Bluebeam. ELF waves are in the same frequency range as human brainwave activity. The human brain operates primarily in delta, 0.54 Hz, theta, 48 Hz, alpha, 8 to 13 Hz, and beta, 13 to 30 Hz frequency bands. ELF waves, by definition, are waves in the 3 to 30 Hz range. This overlap has led to decades of research, some peer-reviewed and mainstream, some deeply fringe, into whether external ELF exposure can alter human mood, cognition, or behavior. This is not idle speculation. The research is real. In the 1960s and 1970s, a Soviet scientist named Yuri Kolodov published research demonstrating that weak magnetic fields in the ELF range could affect animal nervous systems. American researchers, including Robert Becker, published similar findings. In the 1980s, the Soviets were known to be irradiating the U.S. Embassy in Moscow with microwave frequency signals, an event now known as the Moscow signal. And U.S. intelligence was deeply interested in what effect this was having on embassy personnel. Meanwhile, American military and intelligence research into what was variously called psychotronic weapons, non-lethal weapons, and directed energy was proceeding in classified settings. A 2006 Army report on non-lethal weapons technology listed acoustic and microwave devices capable of inducing disorientation, pain, and in some formulations, auditory hallucinations at a distance. The technology that specifically concerns us here is called the microwave auditory effect, or Frey effect, named after its discoverer, Alan Frey, who published his findings in 1962. Frey demonstrated that pulsed microwave radiation, when directed at a human head, could induce the perception of sound, clicks, tones, and eventually words that appeared to come from inside the skull rather than from any external source. The person perceiving the sound had no external hearing sensation. The sound appeared to originate internally. This technology, the ability to project words or sounds into a person's head from a distance using directed microwave beams, is real. It is called the microwave auditory effect. It was discovered in 1962 and published in peer-reviewed literature. The United States Army has patents related to it. A 2004 U.S. Army report explicitly described the potential to use it to project speech into the brains of targeted individuals. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because we are not in the realm of speculation. We are in the realm of documented, peer-reviewed, patented reality. The technology to project voices into human skulls from a distance exists. Does this mean Project Bluebeam is real? No, but it means that one of its central technological claims, the idea that voices could be projected into the minds of millions of people, is not technically impossible. There is one more technology we need to discuss before we move on, and it is perhaps the most speculative of the three, but also the one with the most interesting recent history: space-based holographic projection. Monast claimed that Project Bluebeam would use satellites in low Earth orbit to coordinate the holographic display, essentially using the ionosphere as a projection screen. As noted, the ionosphere can be heated and disturbed by radio waves, creating optical phenomena. The northern lights are the most natural example of this. Charged particles from the sun interact with Earth's magnetic field and atmosphere to create beautiful, shimmering curtains of light. Artificial aurora, the creation of light in the upper atmosphere using charged particle beams, has been demonstrated in laboratory settings and in small-scale outdoor experiments. In 2018, a team of Japanese researchers successfully created a small artificial aurora in the sky above Hokkaido using a sounding rocket. The display was tiny, but it worked. What would it take to scale this up to a globally visible holographic display? An enormous amount of energy, an unprecedented level of orbital infrastructure, and a level of technological sophistication that, as far as the public record shows, does not currently exist. But the principle, again, is not impossible. Here is my honest assessment of the technology question before we move on. Project Blue Beam, as Monast described it, a coordinated, global, real-time holographic and psychotronic operation sufficient to fool 8 billion people simultaneously, is almost certainly not something that exists today or existed in 1994. The technical challenges are enormous, and the institutional coordination required to keep such a program secret strains credulity. But the individual technologies Monast invoked, atmospheric projection, ionospheric manipulation, the microwave auditory effect, LF frequency research, are real. They exist. Some of them are classified, some of them have military applications, and the fact that they are real makes the cultural conversation around Project Blue Beam something other than simply the ravings of a paranoid man. Because the question is not only whether Blue Beam was real, the question is also, why do millions of people believe it might be? What does that belief tell us about the relationship between governments and their citizens, between technology and trust, between power and perception? These are the questions that matter most, and to answer them, we need to understand what has actually happened, the real history of government deception programs that gave Blue Beam its fertile soil. The most powerful argument for taking conspiracy theories seriously, not as literal truth, but as cultural phenomena worthy of serious analysis, is history. Because history shows, repeatedly and without question, that governments lie, that intelligence agencies conduct covert programs of astonishing scope and moral ambiguity, that the things which are dismissed as paranoid fantasy in one decade are confirmed as fact in the next. Let us go through some of these cases carefully because they provide the essential backdrop without which Project Blue Beam cannot be properly understood. Operation Mockingbird. In the 1970s, Senate investigations revealed that the Central Intelligence Agency had, from at least the early 1950s onward, operated a massive program of covert influence over American and international news media. The program, referred to in internal documents and later by journalists as Operation Mockingbird, involved the CIA paying journalists, editors, and media executives at organizations including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, CBS, and numerous foreign outlets to publish stories favorable to American foreign policy objectives, to suppress stories unfavorable to those objectives, and to plant disinformation designed to shape public and elite opinion on Cold War issues. The scale of this program was extraordinary. Carl Bernstein, the Watergate journalist, published a 25,000-word article in Rolling Stone in 1977 detailing its scope. He identified over 400 American journalists who had secretly worked for the CIA over the preceding 25 years. He described the program as involving not just individual journalists, but entire news organizations whose owners had agreed to give the CIA access to their operations. Let me be clear about what this means. For a quarter century, the primary institutions through which American citizens understood the world, newspapers, television networks, wire services, were, in significant part, being covertly managed by an intelligence agency. The information environment that shaped public understanding of reality was being deliberately shaped by a government program most people did not know existed. And this was not speculation. It was confirmed by Senate investigation, by court testimony, by declassified documents. It is not a conspiracy theory. It is established historical fact. Now consider, if you know this happened, what is your prior probability that similar programs, perhaps more sophisticated, perhaps more deeply hidden, exist today? If you were a rational Bayesian reasoner, you would not set that probability at 0. You would set it considerably higher than the cultural default. MKUltra. Between 1953 and 1973, the CIA ran a program of mind control research so extensive, so cruel, and so morally catastrophic that it remains, even decades later, one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of American government. MKUltra, named for its internal designation, involved over 150 separate research projects conducted at 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, and mental health facilities across the United States and Canada. The program investigated, using human subjects who were frequently not informed of their participation and never gave consent, the use of drugs, hypnosis, electroconvulsive therapy, sensory deprivation, psychological abuse, and other techniques to control, erase, alter, or implant human memories and behaviors. Subjects included prisoners, mental patients, military veterans, terminal cancer patients, and random members of the public who were dosed with LSD in CIA-run safe houses while agents observed their behavior. Dozens of people died. Many more were permanently damaged. And the program was destroyed. Not investigated, destroyed. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the bulk of MKUltra files shredded. It was only because a small number of documents had been misfiled in a financial archive that any documentary records survived at all. When those surviving documents were discovered in 1977 and brought before a Senate committee, the revelations were so disturbing that they triggered one of the most significant congressional inquiries into intelligence agency conduct in American history, and what emerged confirmed the worst fears of anyone who had been calling the government out for mind control research. It had been real, it had been vast, and it had operated for 20 years with virtually no oversight. The program included specific research that is directly relevant to our topic today. Research into the creation of false memories, into hypnotic suggestion, into the use of psychedelic and psychoactive compounds to alter perception and make subjects more susceptible to suggestion, and into the development of techniques for implanting beliefs that subjects would hold as genuine personal convictions, even when those beliefs had been externally installed. This is the actual CIA program for altering human perception of reality. It happened, it was funded by your government, it was conducted on people without their consent, and it ran for 20 years before anyone found out. I tell you these things not to suggest that Project Bluebeam is necessarily real. I tell you these things because they are the essential context for understanding why a document like Monast's finds such a ready audience. People who believe in Project Bluebeam are not, in most cases, simply delusional. In many cases, they are people who have read the history, who know about Mockingbird, who know about MKUltra, who know about COINTELPRO and Operation Chaos and the Church Committee revelations, and who have drawn what is, on some level, a reasonable inference. If they did all of that, what else might they have done? What might they still be doing? The mistake, if there is a mistake, is not in asking that question. It is in the specific answer that Project Bluebeam provides, but the question itself is not unreasonable. Let us continue through the history. The Pentagon Papers. In 1971, Daniel Ellsberg released to the New York Times a 7,000-page classified history of U.S. decision-making in Vietnam that demonstrated conclusively that multiple administrations, Democrat and Republican, had systematically lied to the public and to Congress about the nature and progress of the Vietnam War. The government knew, years before the public did, that the war was unwinnable. They continued fighting it anyway, and they lied consistently and deliberately about everything from casualty figures to strategic objectives to the prospects for victory. The COINTELPRO revelations. Also uncovered by Church Committee investigations, COINTELPRO, the FBI's counterintelligence program, was an operation that ran from 1956 to 1971 and involved the systematic infiltration, disruption, and destruction of domestic political organizations. The program targeted the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Panthers, the American Indian Movement, the Socialist Workers' Party, and dozens of other groups. Tactics included forged documents designed to sow distrust, anonymous letters sent to spouses to destroy marriages, planting of evidence, and in at least one case, the murder of Black Panther leader Fred Hampton by Chicago police in coordination with FBI informants, direct lethal violence. This is not ancient history. COINTELPRO ran into the 1970s. Many of the people who were targeted by it are still alive. The institutional DNA that created it has not been fundamentally altered by the reforms of the 1970s. The FBI still operates. The CIA still operates. And while both agencies have been subject to greater oversight since the Church Committee, the fundamental architecture of covert domestic operations, the capacity, the methodology, the culture, has not been dismantled. And then there are the events that Project Bluebeam's believers point to as test runs or preparatory exercises for the main event. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, which we now know from declassified documents, was at minimum significantly misrepresented to Congress and the American public, and may have been entirely fabricated to justify massive U.S. military escalation in Vietnam. Operation Northwoods, the 1962 proposal from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, signed by every member of the Joint Chiefs, brought to the Secretary of Defense, and rejected by President Kennedy, in which the U.S. military proposed staging fake terror attacks on American soil, including airplane hijackings, bombings in Miami and Washington, D.C., and the sinking of a refugee ship, and blaming these attacks on Cuba as a pretext for invasion. This document, when declassified in 1997, was one of the most shocking single documents in American history. The highest military leadership of the United States proposed murdering American citizens and framing a foreign government for it as a pretext for war. It was only rejected by one man, the president, and that president was murdered the following year. I am not drawing conspiratorial connections here. I am simply noting the historical record. Operation Northwoods was real. It was proposed by real generals. It was signed and submitted. The only thing that prevented it from happening was a single presidential veto. This is the world that Project Bluebeam emerged from. Not the world of science fiction and paranoid fantasy, but the world of Senate hearings and declassified documents and the slowly accumulating revelation that governments, and specifically the government of the United States, had engaged in programs of manipulation, deception, and covert action against their own populations that would have seemed impossible to believe if they had not been confirmed. The believers in Project Bluebeam are, in a sense, doing exactly what historians and journalists do, examining the pattern of past behavior and extrapolating forward. Their extrapolation may be wrong, their specific claims may be false, but the underlying instinct, the instinct to distrust government narratives, to look for hidden mechanisms behind public events, to suspect that things are not what they are officially said to be. That instinct is not irrational. It has been validated by history, repeatedly and dramatically. The question is not whether governments are capable of large-scale deception. History has answered that question. The question is whether they are capable of this specific deception. A fake alien invasion staged through holographic technology and psychotronic mind control. And to engage seriously with that question, we need to talk about the current state of relevant technology, the current state of relevant political and social conditions, and the current trajectory of the UFO phenomenon itself, which has taken some extraordinary turns in recent years. Here is something genuinely strange, something that, if you are trying to evaluate Project Bluebeam, you cannot ignore. In 2017, something shifted, something that had been a fringe topic. UFOs, alien visitation, the government's secret knowledge of non-human intelligence, suddenly moved to the center of mainstream media discourse. And it moved there not because of alien enthusiasts or conspiracy theorists, but because of credentialed military pilots, former intelligence officials, and the United States Senate. In December of 2017, the New York Times published an article that had what can only be described as a culture-altering effect. Written by Helene Cooper, Ralph Blumenthal, and Leslie Kean, the article revealed the existence of a secret Pentagon program called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, AATIP. that had been running from 2007 to 2012 with a budget of $22 million, and that had been investigating encounters between U.S. Navy pilots and unidentified aerial phenomena that demonstrated capabilities far beyond any known aircraft. The article included, crucially, video footage. 3 videos, known as FLIR 1, Gimbal, and Go Fast, showing thermal infrared footage from Navy FA-18 fighter jets of objects that moved in ways that defied conventional aerodynamics. No rotors, no obvious propulsion system, extraordinary maneuverability, and the pilots on the recordings experienced military aviators who had spent careers learning to identify aircraft were audibly bewildered. These videos were officially confirmed by the Pentagon in 2020, not dismissed, not explained, confirmed as genuine. The Pentagon said, yes, these are real videos taken by real Navy pilots showing real objects that we cannot explain. Then, in 2022 and 2023, the avalanche began in earnest. Former intelligence officer David Grush testified under oath before the United States Congress that the U.S. government is in possession of non-human intelligence and non-human craft. He said this under oath. He said that multiple witnesses, military and intelligence personnel with the highest levels of security clearance, had told him of programs involving the retrieval and reverse engineering of non-human technology. He said the programs are funded through black budget channels specifically to avoid congressional oversight. He said that people who have tried to come forward about these programs have been threatened, had their careers destroyed, and in some cases died under suspicious circumstances. The congressional hearings that followed were extraordinary, not because of the specific claims, which remain unverified by any independent evidence, but because of the institutional setting. United States senators, on the record, asking former intelligence officers about alien craft and non-human intelligence. The tone was not dismissive, the tone was urgent. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it carefully, with everything we have discussed so far in mind. Why now? The UFO phenomenon has existed as long as there have been human beings looking at the sky. Reports of strange aerial objects go back centuries. The modern UFO era began in 1947 with Kenneth Arnold's sighting near Mount Rainier and the Roswell incident. For 70 years, the government position was, there is nothing to see here. There are no aliens. There are no secret programs. The people who believe these things are cranks. And then, beginning in 2017, that position changed. Not completely, not officially, but meaningfully. The government went from, there is nothing to see, to, there are things we cannot explain, from, we have no programs investigating this, to, yes, we had a program, here are its videos. From UFOs are a fringe topic, to senators are holding congressional hearings and passing laws about UAP. Why? Why the sudden, dramatic institutional shift? There are several possible explanations, and being honest requires us to consider all of them. Explanation 1. The disclosure is genuine. The government has known about non-human intelligence for decades and has been gradually, deliberately managing the public's psychological preparation for full disclosure. The slow release of information, the videos, the congressional testimony, the NASA panel, is a controlled process of societal adjustment designed to prevent the kind of mass panic that immediate, complete disclosure might cause. Explanation 2. The government genuinely does not know what these objects are. The military's surveillance and tracking capabilities have improved dramatically over the past 2 decades, and they are now detecting objects they could not previously track. Some of these objects are adversary technology, Chinese or Russian hypersonic drones, balloons, or other classified aircraft. Some are unknown phenomena, possibly atmospheric or electromagnetic. None of them are alien. The UAP framing is a way of being honest about genuine ignorance without causing panic. Explanation 3, and here is where Project Bluebeam becomes relevant. What if the disclosure itself is the operation? What if the gradual, government-managed, mainstream media-endorsed normalization of the idea that alien craft are real and visiting Earth is not the prelude to truth, but the prelude to a staged event? What if the whole purpose of making UFOs acceptable, of making senators take them seriously, of having the Pentagon officially confirm the videos, is to prepare the population psychologically for a manufactured crisis? In other words, what if disclosure is the first step of Blue Beam? This is not my claim. I am presenting it as a hypothesis that a significant number of Blue Beam believers hold, and I want to be clear about why it is not as easily dismissed as it might initially appear. Consider the following: a false flag event, an event staged by a government and attributed to another party, works best when the population is psychologically prepared to believe in the staged scenario. The population needs to have a prior belief, or at minimum a prior openness to the possibility that the attributed party is real and capable of the alleged act. For a fake alien invasion to work, for a holographic display in the sky to trigger genuine mass belief rather than mass skepticism, the population would first need to believe that aliens exist, that alien craft visit Earth, and that the government knows about it and has been managing the information. Without that prior belief, any staged event would be immediately questioned. People would say, "This can't be real, there are no aliens." But if you spend 10 years, 2013 to 2023, systematically moving the general public from UFOs are a fringe belief for cranks to UAPs are a genuine phenomenon being seriously investigated by the Senate and the Pentagon and NASA. If you do that successfully, then you have prepared the psychological ground for an event that would otherwise have been met with ridicule. I want to be careful here because I am describing a hypothesis, a possible interpretation of publicly observable events, not an assertion of fact. The UAP disclosure movement may be entirely genuine. It may be the result of genuine intelligence, genuine ignorance, and genuine institutional pressure from credible witnesses. I am not in a position to tell you which interpretation is correct. What I can tell you is that the pattern of events, the timing, the institutional endorsement, the specific framing, the careful management of public expectations is consistent with both explanations. It is consistent with genuine disclosure. It is also consistent with a managed psychological preparation campaign. And the fact that it is consistent with both is itself significant. It means we are living in an epistemic situation in which we cannot, with current evidence, distinguish between disclosure and preparation, between reality and stagecraft, between truth and the most sophisticated deception ever attempted. This is what it feels like to live inside a potential Blue Beam moment. Let us also talk about what has been happening with artificial intelligence and synthetic media, because this is the piece of the Blue Beam puzzle that Monast could not have fully anticipated, and that makes the contemporary version of his scenario both more plausible and more terrifying. In 1994, creating a convincing false image or video required significant resources. You needed film equipment, editing facilities, technical expertise. The barrier to creating convincing synthetic media was high enough that it could serve as a kind of natural filter. Crude fakes were usually detectable. That world is gone. Today, using freely available artificial intelligence tools, a person with basic technical knowledge can create a photorealistic video of a world leader saying anything, making any announcement, describing any event, displaying any emotional response in a matter of hours. Deepfake technology, as it is commonly known, has advanced with stunning speed and is currently at a point where even expert analysts cannot reliably distinguish real from synthetic in all cases. Consider what this means for the Blue Beam scenario. In 1994, you would need to actually project holograms into the sky to create the illusion of a fake alien invasion. In 2024, you could potentially achieve much of the same effect by flooding every television screen, every social media feed, every streaming service, and every phone notification with synthetic video of convincing quality, delivered through compromised or commandeered broadcast infrastructure. You would not need to build a satellite-based holographic projector. You would need to control the information ecosystem, which is a different and, in some ways, less fantastical problem. Researchers in media studies and information security have noted that the advent of synthetic media, deep fakes, AI-generated audio, large language model-produced text, has created what they call an epistemic crisis. a situation in which the public's ability to distinguish real events from staged ones is collapsing. Every piece of footage, every recording, every document, every statement is now potentially fake and is known to be potentially fake. This creates a paralysis of verification and a collapse of shared epistemic ground. In this environment, a staged event of sufficient scale and emotional impact would not need to be perfect. It would not need to fool experts. It would only need to overwhelm the normal human mechanisms of skepticism to come fast enough from enough directions simultaneously to create a sensory and emotional experience of reality that the critical faculties simply cannot keep up with. This is not a technological gap. This is a psychological gap, and it exists right now. There is one more piece of contemporary context that we need to discuss, and it is perhaps the most unsettling of all: the real history of UFO-related government psyops that has been confirmed in the historical record. Because it turns out that the US government has, on multiple documented occasions, deliberately used the UFO phenomenon as cover for classified programs, and has, on at least some occasions, actively promoted UFO beliefs among the public to misdirect attention from real secret activities. In 1994, aviation journalist Annie Jacobson published a book called Area 51, based on interviews with former workers at the Nevada test site. In it, she documented how the U-2 spy plane program, one of the most classified aviation programs in American history, was responsible for a significant portion of UFO reports in the 1950s and 1960s. The U-2 flew at altitudes that no known commercial or military aircraft of the time could reach. Pilots who saw it from below, glinting in the sun at high altitude, reported it as a UFO, and CIA analysts tracking these reports deliberately allowed the UFO interpretation to circulate rather than correct it, because acknowledging the U-2 would have required acknowledging that the US was conducting secret surveillance missions. In other words, the government used UFO stories as cover. They actively preferred that people think they were seeing alien spacecraft rather than secret planes. The UFO mythology served government secrecy interests. This was later confirmed by declassified CIA documents, which noted that a significant percentage of the UFO reports cataloged in the 1950s and 1960s could be attributed to classified aircraft programs, and that the government had made a deliberate decision not to dispel the UFO interpretation. So we have confirmed instances of the government using UFO mythology to protect classified programs. We have confirmed instances of the government conducting large-scale deception operations against its own citizens. We have a documented Air Force proposal to use holographic sky projections for psychological warfare. We have real technology capable of projecting voices into human skulls. We have an ongoing, government-endorsed UAP disclosure movement that defies straightforward explanation. None of this proves Project Bluebeam is real, but all of it together creates a context in which the question of whether something like Bluebeam could happen is not simply paranoid fantasy. It is an engineering problem. Project Bluebeam has developed an extraordinary cultural afterlife in the 3 decades since Monast published his document. It has spread through every medium and every platform, from early internet forums in the late 1990s to YouTube in the 2000s to TikTok in the 2020s, accumulating millions of believers, undergoing dozens of modifications and elaborations, and serving as a template for a whole genre of fake event conspiracy theories that now extend far beyond the alien invasion scenario. Understanding how and why it spread, and what that spread tells us, requires looking at both the believers and the skeptics with equal seriousness. Let us start with the skeptics. The mainstream skeptical case against Project Bluebeam is strong, and we should engage with it honestly. The strongest argument against Bluebeam is the coordination problem. To execute even a fraction of what Monast described, to build and deploy a global holographic system, to coordinate a worldwide media deception, to keep the entire operation secret while involving thousands of engineers, scientists, soldiers, pilots, media figures, and government officials. would require a level of organizational competence, loyalty, and security that no human institution has ever demonstrated. The US government cannot keep the existence of basic programs secret for more than a few years before someone leaks, before a FOIA request uncovers something, before a whistleblower comes forward. The idea that a program of this magnitude could remain hidden indefinitely is, on its face, implausible. The second strong skeptical argument is the lack of any real evidence for the program's existence. Monast provided no primary sources, no documents, no inside witnesses. His claims were self-referential. He cited news reports and scientific papers, but his interpretation of them, as pieces of a deliberate plan, was purely his own construction, unsupported by any direct evidence. The third skeptical argument is about Occam's razor. Why would a government wanting to establish control need to stage an alien invasion? There are many simpler mechanisms of social control, economic policy, media management, direct political power, that do not require building an unprecedented global holographic system and coordinating a worldwide psychological operation. The scenario is enormously elaborate for an end goal that could presumably be achieved by simpler means. These are real arguments. They deserve to be taken seriously. But the believers have responses to each of these, and those responses are not without merit. On the coordination problem, modern intelligence operations are not organized as monolithic programs. They are compartmentalized. The people building one component of a system do not know what the system is for. The people who know the purpose of the system do not know the technical details of its components. Compartmentalization is the standard operating methodology of classified programs, and it is explicitly designed to prevent individuals from putting together the full picture. You would not need everyone in the program to know they were part of Bluebeam. You would only need a small group at the top who understood the full scope. On the lack of evidence, classified programs, by definition, generate evidence that is inaccessible. The very fact that we cannot find documentary evidence of a classified program does not mean the program does not exist. It means it is classified. The existence of MKUltra was unknown until documents were accidentally preserved. If Helms had done his job completely, there would be no documentary evidence of MKUltra either, and we would be able to say with confidence that claims about it were conspiracy theory. On Occam's razor, this is perhaps the most interesting counter-argument. Some Bluebeam believers argue that simple mechanisms of social control have stopped working, that populations have become resistant to conventional propaganda, have lost faith in mainstream institutions, and can no longer be reliably managed through ordinary political processes. In this reading, the very implausibility of the alien invasion scenario is its strength. The scale and unambiguity of the staged event would overwhelm even the most skeptical and resistant populations in a way that no political or economic maneuver could. I find none of these arguments fully convincing in either direction. I think the skeptics are probably right that Project Bluebeam, as Monast described it, does not exist and never did. I think the believers are right that the technologies Monast invoked are real, that the historical precedents for government deception are real, and that the question of whether something like Bluebeam could theoretically be attempted is not as absurd as mainstream dismissal would suggest. What I think is most important, what I think this entire topic is really pointing toward, is something more subtle than either of those conclusions. We live in an era in which the technologies of mass deception are developing faster than the technologies of mass verification. We live in an era in which trust in institutions is at historically low levels for historically valid reasons. We live in an era in which the line between real government programs and conspiracy theory has repeatedly been shown by history to be thinner than anyone wanted to admit. In this environment, Project Bluebeam is not primarily a claim about what has happened or what will happen. It is a symptom. It is a cultural artifact that expresses, in the language of science fiction and biblical prophecy, a set of genuine and legitimate anxieties about power, technology, and truth. The question it raises, who controls what you see, who controls what you hear, who decides what you believe, is the central question of the 21st century. And it will not be answered by proving or disproving Project Bluebeam. It will only be answered by building and defending the institutional, technological, and cultural structures that make mass deception impossible, or at minimum, immediately detectable. There is one more thing worth saying about the believers, and it requires a certain amount of care. The Project Bluebeam community, like most large conspiracy theory communities, contains a wide range of people with a wide range of motivations. Some are clearly driven by genuine intellectual curiosity and a healthy skepticism toward authority. Some are driven by religious belief, specifically Christian fundamentalist concern about the signs of the end times. Some are driven by anxiety and a need for explanatory frameworks that give frightening and chaotic events a coherent meaning. And some, a meaningful minority, are driven by bigotry. The Bluebeam narrative has been linked in certain of its iterations to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jewish control of world media and government. It has been linked to white nationalist theories about the suppression of Western civilization. It has been used as a vehicle for racial and religious hatred. This is real, and it should not be minimized. Conspiracy theories that begin as legitimate questioning of authority can, and frequently do, degrade into vehicles for prejudice. The presence of genuine government crimes in the historical record does not immunize any particular conspiracy narrative from contamination by bigotry and hate. When engaging with Project Bluebeam, or with any conspiracy theory, it is necessary to separate the legitimate questions from the hateful answers, to take the anxieties seriously while refusing the scapegoating, to ask the hard questions about power while insisting that the answers be grounded in evidence rather than prejudice. This is difficult. It is easier to either wholesale dismiss all conspiracy thinking as pathological or wholesale embrace it as revelation. The harder and more honest path is to do the actual work of distinguishing what is real from what is imagined, what is evidence from what is pattern matching, what is legitimate systemic critique from what is bigotry wearing the clothes of dissent. We are coming to the end of this investigation, and I want to leave you with something other than ambiguity, even if ambiguity is what the evidence supports. Here is what I believe, stated as plainly as I can. Serge Monast was not a reliable narrator. His document is not sourced, not verifiable, and not supported by any primary evidence. The specific claim that NASA and the UN have developed and are planning to deploy a global holographic alien invasion is almost certainly false. The specific program he described almost certainly does not exist. But the technologies he described are real in their individual components. The history of government deception he pointed to is real. The political and social conditions that would make a large-scale psychological operation both tempting and feasible have never been more present than they are right now. And the ongoing UFO disclosure movement, whatever its true nature, has dramatically lowered the psychological barriers to public belief in alien visitation in ways that would be operationally useful if someone did want to stage such an event. None of that is the same as Bluebeam being real, but all of that together means the conversation is worth having, and it means that maintaining our cognitive infrastructure, our capacity for critical thinking, our ability to verify claims, our resistance to manufactured emotional overwhelm is not just a personal virtue. It is a form of collective defense. The most dangerous version of Project Bluebeam is not the one in which the government projects holograms in the sky. It is the version we are already living in slow motion. A version in which the information environment has been so thoroughly colonized by manufactured content, algorithmic manipulation, and institutional dishonesty that distinguishing real from staged has become genuinely difficult. We do not need satellites and sodium clouds to live inside a manipulated reality. We need only the architecture we have already built. Social media platforms optimized for emotional activation, news ecosystems driven by outrage, advertising systems built on behavioral surveillance, and political institutions that have, over decades, lost the trust of the populations they were built to serve. The fake alien invasion may never come, but the conditions that would make it possible, the conditions that would make billions of people susceptible to believing something that has been manufactured for them, those conditions are here. They are deepening. And the best defense against them is not knowing the specific playbook of any particular conspiracy. It is something older and more difficult. The commitment to truth as a practice. The willingness to sit with uncertainty rather than grasp at the nearest satisfying explanation. The insistence on evidence, on verification, on primary sources, and on the slow, unglamorous work of actually figuring out what is real. Serge Monast died in 1996. His ideas are alive on every platform his era never dreamed of. They have been downloaded millions of times. They have been cited in congressional testimony. They have been referenced in UN debates about information warfare. They have been read by people on 6 continents. What would he make of the world we live in now? A world where the technologies he described are real, where the political conditions he feared have materialized, where the information environment is so saturated with synthesis and manipulation that even professional fact-checkers are struggling to keep up? Would he say, "I told you so"? Or would he look at the world and say, "We still have time"? I hope, the answer is we still have time. Not to prevent the technologies from existing, they exist. Not to restore some imagined golden age of institutional trust. That age, if it ever existed, is not coming back. But to build something new, a literate, resilient, skeptical public that knows how to look at the sky and ask the right questions. That can hold both wonder and wariness. That can distinguish between what it is told and what it can verify. That is the only real defense against Project Bluebeam, and it is the only defense that matters, whether or not the program is real. Project Bluebeam was first described by Serge Monast in 1994. No official government program by this name has ever been confirmed. The technologies described in this documentary are real in their individual components as described. The historical government programs referenced are all matters of public record. Sources are available in the description below. The first step of Monast's plan, the engineering of archaeological discoveries to undermine existing religion, is, on the surface, the most dismissible. Earthquakes don't produce convenient artifacts. Archaeological discoveries don't get engineered by governments on demand. This is not how archaeology works. And yet, when you look at the broader cultural landscape of the last 3 decades, at the way popular understanding of history and religion has been systematically challenged, revised, and in many cases overturned, you encounter something genuinely interesting. Not evidence of a coordinated program, but evidence of a sustained set of cultural forces that have had effects strikingly similar to what Monast described. Consider the trajectory of public discourse about religion's historical foundations over the past 30 years. In the mid-1990s, claims that the historical Jesus was substantially different from the biblical account, that early Christianity was far more diverse than the Orthodox tradition acknowledged, or that the Old Testament contained layers of mythology borrowed from earlier Mesopotamian traditions. These claims existed in academic literature, but had not entered mainstream popular culture with any force. Then came a wave. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered decades earlier, began to receive mainstream popular attention in the 1990s after decades of restricted access provoked controversy and conspiracy theories of their own. The Nag Hammadi texts, Gnostic Gospels that offered radically different accounts of Christian origins, became widely known after Elaine Pagels's accessible books brought them to popular audiences. In 2003, Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, whatever its historical distortions, sold 80 million copies and introduced millions of readers to the idea that the official history of Christianity had been deliberately suppressed. This was not government engineering. This was the natural progression of historical scholarship meeting popular culture, but its effect, the broad cultural destabilization of traditional religious narratives, is exactly what Monast described as the goal of step 1. Now, does this mean it was a conspiracy? No. Does it mean it was part of a deliberate program? Almost certainly not, but it illustrates a phenomenon that is crucial to understanding how Bluebeam believers think. Effects that are structurally identical to a conspiracy can arise from the distributed, uncoordinated actions of many independent agents pursuing their own independent goals. This is what might be called a structural conspiracy, not a conspiracy in the conventional sense of a group of people secretly planning together but a set of outcomes that resembles what a conspiracy would produce, arising from the interaction of systems and incentives rather than from deliberate coordination. The believers in Project Bluebeam are, in many cases, perceiving structural conspiracies and interpreting them as literal ones. The perception of the structure is often accurate. The inference of deliberate coordination is often not. Understanding this distinction is perhaps the most important thing a serious student of conspiracy theory culture can do, because structural conspiracies are real. They have real effects. They demand real responses. The fact that they are not being consciously orchestrated by a shadowy cabal does not make them less dangerous or less worth resisting. The pharmaceutical industry is a structural conspiracy to maximize profit even at the cost of human health. It does not require a secret meeting of pharmaceutical executives rubbing their hands together. It requires only the interaction of financial incentives, regulatory capture, and institutional cultures in ways that systematically prioritize shareholder return over patient welfare. The effect is similar to what a deliberate conspiracy would produce. The mechanism is structural. Both are worth fighting. Both require different strategies to fight effectively. Bluebeam's first step, the archaeological reset, points, however obliquely, to a real structural phenomenon: the systematic destabilization of traditional meaning-making frameworks by a combination of scientific discovery, commercial cultural production, and the democratization of historical scholarship. Whether or not this is being deliberately engineered by a new world order, it is happening. Its effects are real. And understanding those effects requires exactly the kind of careful, critical, historically grounded analysis that the Bluebeam framework, at its best, is trying to provide, however imperfectly. The Big Space Show: Everything We Know About Atmospheric Projection. We discussed atmospheric projection technology in Act 2, but there is significantly more to say about it, and the full picture is more interesting and more unsettling than what we covered there. The concept of projecting images into the sky using natural atmospheric phenomena is not new. Before lasers and satellites, inventors and dreamers proposed using searchlights and water vapor to create large-scale atmospheric displays. In the 1930s, a German company actually patented a device for creating cloud-based advertising, essentially using high-powered spotlights to project images onto low cloud cover. The patent was granted. The device was apparently never deployed at commercial scale. The laser age opened new possibilities. In the 1970s and 1980s, laser light shows became a fixture of planetariums, rock concerts, and outdoor festivals, demonstrating that beams of coherent light could create spectacular visual effects at large scale. The question of whether laser technology could be adapted to create images that appeared to exist in open air without any surface to project onto was a natural extension of this. The first serious research into what might be called aerial displays, images created in open air rather than on surfaces, emerged in the 1980s and 1990s from multiple directions. Military researchers were interested in decoys, objects that would appear to radar and visual tracking systems as real aircraft, but were actually just optical phenomena. Academic researchers were interested in the physics of laser matter interaction at high intensities, and a small number of artists and futurists were interested in the aesthetic and cultural implications of a technology that could create images anywhere, in any space, without infrastructure. The plasma display technology we discussed, using femtosecond lasers to ionize air and create glowing shapes, has been demonstrated at laboratory scale and in outdoor demonstrations. A 2018 demonstration by Ariel Burton, the Japanese company, showed a small plasma display in open air, visible in daylight, creating the company's logo in 3 dimensions. The resolution was low, the persistence was limited, and the scale was tiny, perhaps the size of a soccer ball at a few meters distance, but it was real. It worked. The trajectory of this technology, when you extend it along the curve of its past development, is interesting. If we take the rough historical pattern of most display technologies as a guide, cost drops dramatically, scale increases dramatically, resolution improves substantially. What might a 2034 or 2044 version of this technology look like? Speculating is dangerous. but the direction of travel seems clear, larger, more detailed, more persistent, and considerably cheaper. And there is a military dimension to this research that is worth examining carefully. In 2002, the U.S. Special Operations Command commissioned a study on psychological operations technologies that included explicit discussion of large-scale sky displays. The study noted that a capability to create large-scale sky images over enemy territory, images that could be made to appear miraculous, supernatural, or divine to populations with particular cultural and religious backgrounds, would be an extraordinarily powerful psychological operations tool. It recommended further research. Whether that research was conducted and at what scale is unknown. Meanwhile, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which has a long history of funding technologies that seem like science fiction until they aren't, has funded research in related areas. A 2011 DARPA program called Battlefield Illusion explicitly investigated technologies for creating tactile, visual, and auditory illusions in battlefield environments. The public description of the program was brief and vague, as DARPA descriptions tend to be, but it directly described the creation of illusions in ways that would affect enemy forces' perception of reality. This does not prove that blue beam level sky projection exists, but it documents a consistent thread of military interest in the exact technological capability that Monast described. That thread did not begin and end with the isolated Air Force paper from 1994. It continued through documented programs into the 2010s. What would actually be required to create a convincing global sky display? Let us think through the engineering honestly. The biggest challenge is not creating an image. As we have established, the basic physics of creating images in open air is understood and has been demonstrated. The biggest challenges are scale, coherence, and simultaneity. Scale, creating an image visible to millions of people simultaneously across a wide geographic area would require either a single projection source of extraordinary power, operating perhaps from orbit, or thousands of coordinated projection sources distributed across the target area. Both present enormous engineering challenges. An orbital projector would need to beam energy down through the atmosphere with sufficient intensity to create plasma or other visual effects at the scale of city blocks. The beam would have to pass through weather, atmospheric turbulence, and varying density gradients. The power requirements would be extraordinary. Coherence. An image created by thousands of distributed sources would need to be precisely synchronized to appear as a single coherent image from any viewing angle. This is a non-trivial coordination problem, but it is essentially a software and communications problem rather than a physics problem. Given modern computing and networking, it is more tractable than the energy problem. Simultaneity. To create a globally simultaneous event, one that would prevent populations in different time zones from hearing about the event and rationally analyzing it before experiencing it, would require either staggered timing, night falling in different places, with the display appearing at the same local time globally, or extraordinary speed of deployment. None of these problems are insolvable in principle. All of them are extremely challenging with current technology, but extremely challenging with current technology has been the accurate description of many things that became possible within a generation. The internet was extremely challenging with 1970s technology. GPS was extremely challenging with 1960s technology. mRNA vaccines were extremely challenging with 2000s technology. The point is not that blue beam exists. The point is that evaluating it purely on technological grounds, saying it is impossible, therefore it is paranoid fantasy, is not a position that a careful, historically grounded evaluation supports. The voice of God, psychotronic weapons, and the microwave auditory effect. We have already discussed the Frey effect, the discovery that pulsed microwave radiation can cause humans to perceive sounds that appear to originate inside their skulls. This technology is real, documented, and patented, but to fully understand its implications for the blue beam scenario, we need to go deeper into both the technology and the history of its military applications. Alan Frey published his initial findings in 1962 in the Journal of Applied Physiology. He demonstrated that human subjects could hear sounds, clicks, buzzing, hissing, when exposed to pulsed microwave radiation at specific frequencies and intensities. The sounds appeared to originate inside the head, near the back of the skull. They were perceived even by people with significant hearing loss in the normal auditory range, suggesting that the effect was not transmitted through the normal ear mechanism, but through direct interaction between the microwave radiation and the auditory cortex, or cochlea. Frey's work attracted immediate classified attention. The CIA, already neck-deep in M-Culture, was intensely interested in any technology that could affect human mental states from a distance. The Soviets, whose embassy the CIA would later learn to be the source of the Moscow signal microwave bombardment, were conducting parallel research. The military applications were obvious to anyone with imagination. A technology that could project sounds into the heads of enemy soldiers, sounds that appeared to come from inside their own minds, would be the most disorienting and demoralizing weapon ever invented. Research proceeded in classified settings throughout the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. The available evidence, from what has been declassified, from what has been patented, from what researchers who worked adjacent to classified programs have said on the record, suggests that the technology advanced well beyond Frey's initial demonstration. By the late 1970s, researchers were apparently able to project not just simple sounds, but intelligible speech into human subjects using pulsed microwave systems. The range was initially very short, meters, but range is an engineering problem. More power, better beam control, better atmospheric compensation, and the range extends. A 1998 U.S. Army research document described a mob excess deterrent using silent audio, Medusa system. The proposal involved using the microwave auditory effect to broadcast a behavioral modification program to enemy populations or to crowds. The specific proposal included the capacity to make large groups of people simultaneously hear sounds or voices that appeared to come from within their own heads. In 2008, a New York-based company called Holosonics demonstrated a commercial product called the Audio Spotlight, a speaker that uses ultrasound to create a highly directional beam of audio that can only be heard within a very narrow cone in front of the speaker, and that appears to the listener to originate from within their own head rather than from an external speaker. This is not the microwave auditory effect. It uses ultrasound rather than microwaves, but it demonstrates the general principle that internal voice audio technology has moved from classified military labs into commercial products. The military version, using microwave rather than ultrasound, has the crucial advantage of range. Microwaves penetrate much further than ultrasound through open air. A high-power microwave auditory effect system could, in principle, project apparent internal sounds into a human being from a considerable distance. The specific range capabilities of current systems are, naturally, classified. What would this mean in the context of Project Bluebeam? Monast described the third step as the creation of a global experience of divine communication, a voice that would appear to speak to every individual in their own language, in their own private mental space, conveying a message tailored to their cultural and religious context. He described this as the mechanism by which the population would be moved to accept the New World religion, not by seeing something in the sky, but by hearing something in their own heads that confirmed the sky event as genuine. The technical requirements for this step are, if anything, even more challenging than those for Step 2. A directional microwave auditory effect system works by beaming energy at a specific target. To beam it at billions of simultaneous targets across the globe in a coordinated and personalized way would require an infrastructure of extraordinary complexity. But, and this is interesting, the same effect could be achieved partially by a different mechanism, the direct broadcast of audio signals through consumer electronics. Every person on Earth who owns a phone or a radio or a television is already connected to a broadcast infrastructure. A coordinated compromise of this infrastructure, essentially a broadcast hijacking of the most complete and thorough kind, combined with deep fake audio and the naturally resonant quality of a voice broadcast through a device close to one's ear, might create something functionally similar to what Monast described, without requiring any satellite-based directed energy. We are, in other words, already halfway there, not because anyone has built the infrastructure for Blue Beam, but because the infrastructure of the modern information ecosystem has, as a byproduct of its commercial development, created the conditions under which a sufficiently sophisticated broadcast event could reach nearly every human being on Earth simultaneously, in their own language, through a device in their own pocket. The manufactured apocalypse, economic collapse, alien ships, and the surrender of sovereignty. The fourth step of Project Bluebeam is, in some ways, the most politically interesting because it most directly addresses the question that motivates the entire conspiracy theory: what is the goal? Monast's answer is unambiguous: total control, a single world government, a single currency, a single military, a single religion, the elimination of national sovereignty, individual liberty, and spiritual diversity in favor of a unified global authority that controls every aspect of human life. This is, of course, the standard end state of most New World Order conspiracy theories, and it shares the standard problem. It is extraordinarily vague about specifics. Who, exactly, are the people running the New World Order? What do they actually want? How do they plan to govern a planet of 8 billion people? And why would a global government be necessarily worse than a collection of national governments, many of which are authoritarian, brutal, or simply incompetent? These questions do not get serious answers in Monast's document, and they do not get serious answers in the broader Bluebeam community. The New World Order remains a dark abstraction, powerful, malevolent, globalist, without the specificity that would allow it to be either confirmed or refuted. But here is what is interesting about Step 4 from an analytical perspective. The scenario it describes, manufactured crisis leading to demand for centralized authority, is not at all uncommon in real political history. It is, in fact, one of the most well-documented mechanisms of political transformation. Scholars call it the shock doctrine, after Naomi Klein's book of the same name. Klein documented how economic crises, many of them naturally occurring, some of them deliberately created or exacerbated, have been used by economic and political elites to impose radical restructuring that could not have been achieved through normal democratic processes. The mechanism is the same as Monast describes: create or exploit a crisis, generate public panic and demand for relief, offer a pre-prepared solution that concentrates power in fewer hands, and implement it rapidly before the public can evaluate it clearly. This has happened in Chile in 1973, in Russia in the 1990s, in various ways during the 2008 financial crisis and its aftermath. The mechanism is real. The specific claim of Bluebeam, that the crisis will be an alien invasion, is fantastical, but the underlying political model is historically documented. This is perhaps the deepest truth embedded in the Bluebeam narrative. Not that aliens will be faked, but that manufactured crisis is a real and historically documented tool of political transformation. The specific scenario is implausible. The structural dynamic it describes is not. The cultural history of Bluebeam from fringe to mainstream. How a 1994 Quebec document conquered the internet. The internet history of Project Bluebeam is, in its own way, as fascinating as the content of the theory itself. It is a case study in the transmission and mutation of ideas through digital networks, in how a marginal document, produced in obscurity by a man most of his contemporaries had never heard of, became one of the most shared conspiracy theories in the world within a generation of its author's death. The first phase of Bluebeam's internet spread was the early World Wide Web era, roughly 1996 to 2003. In this period, the document was primarily circulated through early conspiracy theory websites, GeoCities pages, early message boards, and email chains. The audience was small and self-selecting, people who were already interested in government conspiracies, New World Order theories, and UFOs. The document was read in its original form, or close to it, and discussed in the context of other theories with which it overlapped: the Denver Airport conspiracy, the Georgia Guidestones, HARP. In this period, Bluebeam was fringe of fringe. It was too specifically technological, too specifically Christian in its end times framing, and too obscure in its sourcing to attract mainstream conspiracy interest. The major conspiracy theory platforms of the era, Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM radio show, for instance, occasionally touched on related themes but did not focus on blue beam specifically. The second phase, roughly 2004 to 2010, was the YouTube era. YouTube launched in 2005, and within 2 years, it had become the primary distribution medium for long-form conspiracy content. Early Bluebeam videos appeared on the platform beginning around 2007. These were initially simple recordings of Monast's document being read aloud, often over dramatic music and stock footage, but they attracted thousands of views, far more than any previous distribution of the material had achieved. What YouTube did, crucially, was make Bluebeam part of a visual culture. When you read a document describing holographic sky projections, the concept remains somewhat abstract. When you watch a video that intersperses descriptions of sky projections with actual footage of laser light shows, military exercises, and atmospheric phenomena, the concept becomes viscerally real in a way that text cannot achieve. YouTube Bluebeam videos were, in many cases, genuinely good pieces of video production, and their emotional impact on viewers who encountered them without prior context was significant. This is also the period when Bluebeam began its most significant mutation, the incorporation of real events as confirmations of the theory. The first major real-world event to be incorporated into the Bluebeam narrative was the Norway Spiral of December 2009. Over several minutes, residents of northern Norway observed a spectacular and genuinely unusual atmospheric phenomenon, a spiraling blue light in the sky that appeared to expand outward from a central point, creating a perfect spiral before collapsing into a dark void. The event was photographed and filmed by thousands of people and was initially entirely unexplained by authorities. The Bluebeam community immediately identified this as either a test of the Bluebeam projection system or an artifact of HARP experiments gone visible. The actual explanation, announced by the Russian government within hours, was a failed test launch of a Bulava missile from a submarine in the White Sea, which had begun spiraling out of control and released its fuel in a pattern that created the optical effect. The explanation was credible, supported by the observed trajectory of the spiral and confirmed by Russia. But in the Bluebeam community, the official explanation was immediately labeled a cover story. And this is the crucial dynamic that conspiracy theory researchers call non-falsifiability. Any official explanation for an anomalous event becomes, within the conspiracy framework, additional evidence of the conspiracy. The cover story is itself the conspiracy. This non-falsifiability is a structural feature of mature conspiracy theories, and it makes them extremely resistant to evidence-based challenge. It is also, from an epistemological standpoint, a serious problem. A theory that cannot in principle be disproven by any evidence is not a scientific theory, it is a faith claim. The Norway Spiral was followed by dozens of similar incorporations. Every significant atmospheric anomaly, strange lights in the sky, unusual cloud formations, bizarre radar patterns, was added to the Bluebeam confirmation file. Every UFO-related government disclosure was interpreted as a step in the preparation for the Bluebeam event. Every advance in holographic technology was noted as progress toward the global display system. By 2012, the year of the Mayan calendar apocalypse scare, Bluebeam had acquired an eschatological urgency that matched the cultural moment perfectly. The Coachella performance of the Tupac hologram in April 2012 sent Bluebeam interest to new heights. If a decade-dead rapper could apparently perform live on stage, what might a government with classified technology and unlimited resources be able to create? The fact that the Tupac performance used a simple and well-understood Pepper's ghost technique, and not holographic technology in any technically meaningful sense, was irrelevant to the emotional impact of the event. It looked like a hologram. It was impressive. And in the minds of Bluebeam believers, it served as confirmation that the technology was closer to deployment than they had imagined. The third phase, 2010 to present, is the social media era, and in this phase, Bluebeam has achieved something it never managed in any previous medium: genuine mainstream penetration. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and especially TikTok have carried Bluebeam material to audiences who would never have encountered it through the self-selecting channels of early internet conspiracy communities. TikTok has been particularly significant. Short-form video content about blue beam, typically 60 to 90 seconds, often using compelling visuals and sound design, has achieved tens of millions of views. More importantly, it has reached a young audience, people in their teens and 20s who have grown up in a media environment of pervasive cynicism about institutions, widespread familiarity with deep fakes and digital manipulation, and significant awareness of real government deception revealed through recent history. For this audience, Bluebeam is not primarily a Cold War Christian fundamentalist end-times prophecy. It has been stripped of much of Monast's specifically religious framing and repurposed as a general, government is planning something warning, a loose framework for anxieties about technological control, corporate power, and institutional deception that resonates deeply with the post-2008, post-Snowden, post-COVID information environment. This mutation is fascinating and important. It means that Bluebeam as a cultural phenomenon is no longer simply Serge Monast's document. It is an evolving, decentralized, crowdsourced theory that has absorbed new elements and shed old ones as the cultural context has shifted. The specifically Christian framing has faded in many iterations. The specific technological details have been updated to incorporate more contemporary technologies. Deepfakes, AI, 5G, quantum computing. The geopolitical villains have shifted with cultural fashions. What remains constant is the core emotional architecture, the sense that reality is being managed for you, that the sky itself might be a screen, that the voice you think is your own conscience might be someone else's signal, and that the event that changes everything, whatever it turns out to be, is already in preparation. Blue Beam and Religion, the End Times Dimension. Why fundamentalist Christianity provides Blue Beam's deepest context. To understand Project Blue Beam fully, you cannot separate it from its religious context. Monast was not primarily a technological analyst or a political scientist. He was a Catholic believer who understood the conspiracy he was describing in explicitly theological terms. The New World Order he feared was not primarily a political project. It was a satanic one. The fake alien invasion was not primarily a psyop. It was the preparation for the Antichrist. This dimension of Bluebeam has received less analytical attention than its technological and political dimensions, in part because mainstream secular analysis tends to be uncomfortable with theological frameworks, and in part because the religious framing makes the theory easier to dismiss as simple fundamentalist paranoia. But this is a mistake. The theological framework is not incidental to Bluebeam. It is its central organizing principle. And understanding it illuminates something important, not just about Monast's specific claims, but about the broader relationship between apocalyptic religious belief and conspiracy theory culture. Christian eschatology, the theology of the end times, provides the interpretive framework within which Bluebeam makes its deepest sense. In traditional Christian eschatology, particularly in the premillennialist tradition that has been dominant in evangelical and fundamentalist Christianity since the 19th century, the end of history is structured around a sequence of events that includes the rise of a global government, the emergence of a world leader who appears to be a savior but is actually the Antichrist, the implementation of a global economic system, the mark of the beast, and a period of tribulation before the return of Christ. For Christians who hold this eschatological framework, the New World Order is not a speculative political possibility. It is a theological prophecy. It is going to happen. The question is not whether it will come, but when and how. And any observable trends in the direction of global governance, unified currency, centralized religion, or the degradation of national sovereignty are not just political developments. They are signs. They are confirmations of prophecy. They are the footsteps of the apocalypse. Monast, coming from this tradition, read the technological and political developments of the early 1990s, globalization, the rise of the United Nations, the early internet, the New Age spiritual movement, the increasing authority of international institutions through this interpretive lens. Every development that increased international cooperation was a step toward the one-world government. Every challenge to traditional Christianity, from New Age spirituality to historical scholarship about Jesus, was a step toward the one-world religion. And any sufficiently dramatic manufactured event, one that would shock the world population into accepting these developments, would be the staged Great Tribulation. Project Bluebeam is, at its deepest level, a technological interpretation of the Book of Revelation. The fake alien invasion is the fake second coming, or the fake alien savior, or the Antichrist's debut performance. The psychotronic voice broadcasting is the counterfeit Holy Spirit. The New World Order government that emerges from the manufactured crisis is the beast's empire. This is not a minor nuance. This is the theory's structural core, and it means that for believers who hold the premillennialist eschatological framework, Bluebeam is not primarily a technical claim about holographic projectors. It is a prophetic claim about the spiritual nature of the coming deception. The technology is just the mechanism through which the spiritual deception will be executed. Understanding this helps explain several features of Bluebeam belief that would otherwise be puzzling. It explains why the theory is almost unfalsifiable. From within the theological framework, any apparent disconfirmation can be interpreted as part of the deception. It explains why the theory is so resistant to technological debunking. The technology is secondary to the spiritual reality, and believers who are not primarily interested in the technical details can accept the core claim regardless of whether the specific technological implementation is feasible. And it explains why Bluebeam belief tends to occur in combination with a range of other beliefs about the Illuminati, about Freemasonry, about Jewish banking conspiracies, about the United Nations, because all of these fit within the same eschatological framework as components of the Antichrist system. This religious dimension also explains the most troubling aspect of Bluebeam culture, its propensity to merge with anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. The idea that a small, powerful, transnational group controls the world's governments, media, and financial systems, and is working to destroy Christianity and implement a satanic world order, is a framework that has been used to target Jewish people for centuries. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, the most widely distributed anti-Semitic text in history, tells essentially this story. And the New World Order framework, despite not naming Jews in many of its contemporary iterations, is structurally identical to traditional anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. This does not mean that everyone who believes in Bluebeam is anti-Semitic. Many are not, and many are not primarily motivated by the religious dimension at all. But the theological and political framework within which Bluebeam originated is one that has historically proven capable of generating or absorbing anti-Semitic content, and serious engagement with the conspiracy requires acknowledging this. The challenge for anyone who wants to take the legitimate concerns embedded in Bluebeam seriously, the concerns about government deception, about technological control, about the erosion of privacy and autonomy, is to separate those legitimate concerns from the theological and sometimes bigoted frameworks in which they are often embedded. This is possible, but it requires precision and intellectual honesty that the conspiracy genre often does not reward. The Snowden dimension: surveillance, control, and what we actually know. The real information state and what it tells us about Bluebeam. In June 2013, Edward Snowden walked into a Hong Kong hotel room with 4 laptop computers and a collection of classified documents from the National Security Agency that would, over the following months, fundamentally alter public understanding of the relationship between digital technology and government surveillance. What Snowden revealed was, in its scope and detail, more extraordinary than almost anyone had suspected. The NSA had built a global surveillance system of unprecedented comprehensiveness, PRISM, which required major internet companies, including Google, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft, to provide real-time access to user data, X-Keyscore, which allowed analysts to search nearly everything a user does on the internet, Muscular, which tapped directly into the communications links between data centers belonging to Yahoo and Google, and dozens of other programs of varying classification and scope. The system Snowden revealed could, in practice, track and record the communications of virtually everyone on Earth with an internet connection or a phone. It had done so, to varying degrees of completeness, for years, and its existence had been flatly denied by the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, under oath before the Senate Intelligence Committee in March 2013, a denial that was, in the light of Snowden's documents, simply a lie. What does this have to do with Project Bluebeam? Everything and nothing. Let me explain. The Snowden revelations confirmed in extraordinary detail that the intelligence agencies of the United States had built an infrastructure of mass surveillance that was far more comprehensive, far more sophisticated, and far more technically advanced than the public had been told. They confirmed that senior officials had lied about this infrastructure under oath. They confirmed that the gap between what the public was told about intelligence capabilities and what those capabilities actually were could be enormous. This is the epistemic situation in which Project Bluebeam exists. We live in a world in which we know that our intelligence agencies have built classified programs of extraordinary technical sophistication, have lied about them to Congress and the public, and have the institutional capacity and legal authority to keep them secret for years or decades. We know this not from conspiracy theory, but from official documents, from congressional testimony, from the journalism of the New York Times and The Guardian. In this world, what is the prior probability that a classified program of the kind Monast described could exist without public knowledge? If your answer, before Snowden, was essentially zero, the government couldn't keep something like that secret, the Snowden revelations should have updated that answer substantially, not to certain or even probable, but substantially upward from zero. The surveillance infrastructure Snowden revealed was built by tens of thousands of people across dozens of private contractors and government agencies. It involved the cooperation of major technology companies. It required enormous funding, passed through multiple appropriations processes, and it was entirely unknown to the general public until a single contractor decided to blow the whistle. The lesson of Snowden is not that Bluebeam is real. The lesson of Snowden is that the government's capacity to develop and conceal technology programs of extraordinary scope is substantially greater than the default assumption of a democratic society should accommodate. The lesson is epistemic humility, a recognition that the space of things we don't know is considerably larger than comfortable assumptions about transparency and oversight suggest. This is not paranoia. This is the lesson of the evidence. And it is the reason why Bluebeam, however fantastical its specific claims, continues to find an audience among people who have done the reading. The Snowden revelations also introduced a dimension that Monast did not anticipate, or at least did not describe in detail: the surveillance state's capacity for individualized psychological profiling. The NSA's capabilities, as Snowden revealed them, were not primarily about watching specific people. They were about collecting everything from everyone and then applying computational analysis to that data to identify patterns, predict behaviors, and develop targeted intervention capabilities. In the context of Bluebeam, this is significant. A Bluebeam-type psychological operation in the contemporary world would not need to be a one-size-fits-all broadcast. With the data infrastructure revealed by Snowden, combined with the commercial data infrastructure of social media platforms, which is in many ways more comprehensive than the NSA's government-owned data, it would be possible, in principle, to design a psychological operation that was individually tailored to each target. The voice in your head would not say the same thing to you that it said to your neighbor. It would say the specific thing that your behavioral profile, your search history, your message history, and your psychological assessment identified as most likely to cause you to accept the intended conclusion. This is the 21st century version of the microwave auditory effect. Not a directed energy beam that projects a voice into your skull, but an information ecosystem so comprehensively surveilled and algorithmically optimized that the voice that reaches you through your newsfeed, through your recommended content, through the targeted messages that appear alongside your searches, is, in a very meaningful sense, a voice designed specifically for you by a system that knows you better than you know yourself. We are not talking about Project Bluebeam. We are talking about Facebook's ad targeting system. We are talking about Google's search personalization. We are talking about TikTok's recommendation algorithm. These systems are not designed to stage a fake alien invasion. They are designed to sell you products and maximize your time on platform. But the infrastructure they represent, the comprehensive personal profiling, the individually targeted message delivery, the psychological optimization of content, is, structurally, everything that Monast described as the psychotronic component of Bluebeam. The question is not whether the infrastructure exists. It does. The question is whether it would ever be used for the purposes Monast described. That depends entirely on who controls it and what their goals are. And the answer to that question is, in the current environment, considerably less certain than it would be comfortable to assume. The global context. Who else is thinking about this? Bluebeam in the international policy debate on information warfare. Project Bluebeam is not simply an American or Canadian phenomenon. It has spread globally, taking on different inflections and emphases in different cultural and political contexts, and the underlying concerns it expresses about the vulnerability of populations to mass deception, about the weaponization of information technology, about the gap between official reality and lived experience, are being discussed in serious academic and policy contexts around the world. The field of information warfare has never been more actively discussed than it is today. Every major military power, the United States, Russia, China, NATO, Israel, has developed and published doctrine on information operations, the use of information as a weapon to shape the perceptions and decisions of adversaries and populations. The academic literature on cognitive warfare, the targeting of human cognition as a domain of military and political competition, has exploded in the past decade. NATO has explicitly identified cognitive warfare, the attempt to influence individuals' thinking and decision-making processes, as the sixth warfighting domain, alongside land, sea, air, space, and cyber. NATO documents describe cognitive warfare as seeking to exploit the human domain to influence states, organizations, or individuals. The specific techniques described include information manipulation, psychological operations, and what the documents call narrative warfare, the attempt to control the interpretive frameworks through which populations understand events. Russia's Gerasimov Doctrine, a framework for hybrid warfare attributed to Russian Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov, describes a mode of conflict in which military and non-military means are combined, in which the information environment is as important as the physical one, and in which manufactured public perception can be as strategically effective as military force. Russian information operations targeting Western elections, Russian manipulation of social media during the Ukraine conflict, Russian deployment of disinformation about the MH17 shootdown. These are real, documented cases of information warfare being used at scale against real populations with real effects. China's unrestricted warfare doctrine, articulated by PLA colonels Chao Liang and Wang Xiangsui in 1999, describes a form of warfare that transcends military domains and includes psychological operations, economic warfare, media manipulation, and the exploitation of an adversary's own social media and information infrastructure against it. China's documented information operations, including documented campaigns on TikTok, WeChat, and other platforms, have been studied and confirmed by academic researchers. These are not conspiracy theories. These are documented, published, official doctrines of real military powers describing the use of information and psychological manipulation as weapons in real conflicts. The question of whether any of these doctrines envisions operations at the scale of Project Bluebeam, a globally coordinated fake alien invasion, is almost certainly no. But the question of whether the underlying approach, using manufactured information events to trigger specific psychological and behavioral responses in target populations, is a real component of current and future warfare, is also no. It is unquestionably yes. The specific scenario of Bluebeam is implausible. The general framework it describes, a world in which information itself is weaponized, in which manufactured events shape political reality, in which the line between reality and strategic fiction is deliberately blurred, is the world we already live in. What to do with all of this? A guide to epistemic survival. Practical philosophy for a world where Bluebeam is possible. We have spent the better part of 60 minutes and 60,000 words examining Project Bluebeam from every angle: its origin, its technology, its historical context, its cultural spread, its religious dimensions, and its relevance to the contemporary information environment. We have been honest about what is real, what is likely false, and what is genuinely uncertain. I want to end with something more practical, with a set of principles that might help a thoughtful person navigate the world that Bluebeam describes, not because Bluebeam is necessarily real, but because the conditions it warns about are. The first principle is, institutional skepticism is not the same as institutional nihilism. The history of government deception does not support the conclusion that all government claims are false. It supports the conclusion that government claims require verification, and that institutional self-interest is a real variable in evaluating official narratives. The appropriate response to learning about MKUltra and Mockingbird and COINTELPRO is not to distrust everything the government says. It is to develop more sophisticated frameworks for evaluating what governments say, to demand transparency and accountability, and to support the independent institutions, journalism, academic research, civil society, whose function is precisely to provide that accountability. The second principle is, verify before sharing. The speed at which Bluebeam-related content spreads on social media is made possible in large part by the reflex to share things that feel true, surprising, or confirming of existing beliefs without checking them against independent sources. This reflex is not stupidity. It is a natural response to information overload, algorithmic amplification, and the social dynamics of online communities. But it is exploitable by anyone who wants to spread false information. And in an environment where deep fakes and synthetic media make convincing false content easier to produce than ever before, the habit of checking before sharing is not just civic virtue, it is self-defense. The third principle is, understand your own motivated reasoning. All human beings engage in motivated reasoning, the tendency to evaluate evidence in ways that confirm prior beliefs and support desired conclusions. This is not a flaw unique to conspiracy theorists. It is a universal feature of human cognition. The specific challenge of motivated reasoning in the context of conspiracy theories is that the theories are often structured in ways that make every piece of evidence, confirming or disconfirming, consistent with the theory. This is non-falsifiability, and it is the epistemic signature of a theory that has abandoned the discipline of evidence. The antidote is not certainty in the opposite direction, but a genuine commitment to the possibility of being wrong and to the practices seeking disconfirming evidence, consulting experts with contrary views, updating beliefs when evidence demands it, that make learning from evidence possible. The fourth principle is, the map is not the territory. Conspiracy theories are maps. They are frameworks for organizing information and interpreting events. Like all maps, they can be useful, pointing to real features of the landscape, or misleading, distorting distances, leaving out key features, projecting the mapmaker's preferences. Bluebeam as a map is useful insofar as it highlights real features of the landscape, the history of government deception, the development of information warfare technologies, the vulnerability of populations to mass psychological manipulation. It is misleading insofar as it projects a level of coordination, intentionality, and specific technological capability that the evidence does not support. A good navigator uses the map's useful features while remaining alert to its distortions. They check the map against the terrain rather than adjusting their perception of the terrain to match the map. The fifth principle is, protect your attention. The information environment you inhabit shapes your perception of reality more than almost any other factor. The content you consume, the sources you trust, the communities you participate in, the emotional registers you inhabit when you engage with information. All of these shape the lens through which you interpret events. In an environment of pervasive algorithmic manipulation, protecting the quality of your information diet is not optional. It is the foundational act of epistemic self-defense. This does not mean avoiding challenging or disturbing content. It means being deliberate about what you consume, seeking out primary sources when possible, balancing perspectives, and maintaining enough distance from any single interpretive community to retain the capacity for independent judgment. The sixth and final principle is perhaps the most important and the most difficult. Live in the uncertainty. The honest answer to the question, is Project Bluebeam real, is, we don't know for certain and we can't know for certain, and that uncertainty is itself the appropriate epistemic state given the available evidence. This is uncomfortable. Human beings are wired to prefer certainty over uncertainty, clear answers over ambiguous ones, stories with villains and heroes over complex systems without clearly assignable responsibility. Conspiracy theories satisfy this preference. They provide certainty, perhaps false certainty, but certainty. The debunker's response, this is all nonsense, there is no conspiracy, the government is not doing anything like this, provides a different certainty, also perhaps false. The honest position is in the middle, a careful, evidence-grounded uncertainty that takes the real history seriously, evaluates the technology honestly, acknowledges what we don't know, and refuses to collapse into either the comfort of the conspiracy or the comfort of the dismissal. That position is harder to hold. It is less emotionally satisfying. It does not give you a clear enemy or a clear reassurance, but it is the position most likely to be accurate. And in a world where accuracy about what is true and what is manufactured is the single most important survival skill, it is worth the effort. Serge Monast warned us that the sky would become a screen. He warned us that the voices we heard might not be our own. He warned us that the event that felt most real, the most massive, the most overwhelming, the most undeniably significant thing any of us had ever witnessed might be the most carefully constructed lie. He may have been wrong about the mechanism. He may have been wrong about the timeline. He may have been wrong about NASA and the UN and the holographic projectors. But he was not wrong about this. The human mind is the most important battleground of our time, and the capacity to know what is real, to walk through a world saturated with synthetic experience and manufactured crisis and algorithmic manipulation, and maintain a clear, grounded sense of what is actually happening. That capacity is precious. It is fragile. It requires defense. It requires cultivation. Whether or not there is a Project Bluebeam, there is a project. It is the project of your mind, and whether that project is yours, whether your beliefs are your own, or whether they have been placed there by forces that do not have your interests at heart, that is the question worth spending a lifetime answering. Look up at the sky, ask yourself what you see, and then ask yourself how you know. That is where the real investigation begins. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.